So once again, thank you all again for joining Project Management 101, part of the YouthActionNet Virtual Learning Series, today, February 27, 2017. Our presenter today is Jessica Ellisberg. She's the YouthActionNet Program and Operations Manager here at IYF, and she wears many, many hats. Jessie manages the Laureate Global Fellowship Program and supports network development and national institutes in sub-Saharan Africa. She has over 15 years of experience in teaching and training around the world and holds a master's degree in international development studies from George Washington University and a bachelor's degree in language and linguistics from Whitman College. Jessie, I'm now going to turn it over to you so you can dive into today's exciting topic of project management.
All right. Thank you so much, Whitney. Today we're going to take you all through a brief overview of what project management is all about and provide a foundation on key constraints as well as the phases of project management. And then we're going to look at the disciplines of project management, focus in on two of those disciplines to share a couple of great tools that we think you all will find really useful in the projects that you're already working on. And we want this to be as useful and as user-friendly as possible, so please do ask questions via the Q&A box as we go, and be sure to pay attention as there might be a quiz. So let's jump in and talk about what project management is. It's probably helps to start with some definitions. So when we talk about a project, we mean a product or service that needs to be completed within a fixed time frame. As you can imagine, a lot of things might be considered projects. Project management is the discipline of initiating, planning, executing, controlling, and closing the work of a team to achieve the specific goals and to meet success criteria for a given project. Now, as helpful as Wikipedia can be with definitions, we think this is still a bit technical and vague. So here's another way of thinking about it. Abraham Maslow famously said that if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to treat every problem like a nail. So project management is a really great toolbox. It gives you a variety of tools to help you achieve your goals efficiently and effectively without having to treat everything like a nail. Now, there's a lot of toolboxes that you can choose from when it comes to project management. If you're familiar with the field at all, you may have heard of PMI or PMP, which is an internationally recognized project management certification. You may have heard of Agile or Scrum, and that's related specifically to software development projects. But our favorite toolbox is the PMD Pro. This is the one we're going to focus on today. And the reason we like PMD Pro is because it was developed specifically for international development projects, so we think it's the most relevant for social ventures. So now that we've talked a little bit about what we mean by project management, let's talk about project management constraints. First, it's important to recognize that projects come in all shapes and sizes. So your project might be hosting a group of students as volunteers for social enterprises over a 3-week period. It might be offering ongoing workshops on filmmaking for primary school students over the course of a year. Or it might be organizing a one-day fundraiser to cover the cost of a young woman's education. A project could even be something like delivering a virtual learning session on project management. So the point I want to make is that projects can be large or small, they can involve any number of people, and they can be very complex or they can be relatively simple. But regardless of the size and complexity of your project, they all face 3 key constraints. The first is scope and quality. You have to consider what the products or services are that the project's going to produce, and then what work actually has to get done to produce those things. The second one is costs and resources. So you also need to be thinking about the money, materials, and effort that are available to deliver the project's products or services. And finally, you have to think about time and schedule. How much time is required to complete all of the different project components? So these 3 constraints might seem like common sense, but it can be really easy to lose sight of one or more of them when you're actually in the day-to-day of working on a project. You really want to remember all of these constraints and think about them when you make decisions related to your project. Ultimately, project management has to be a balancing act. If you focus too much on the quality and scope, you might not meet deadlines, or you might spend too many resources on getting your project done. On the other hand, focusing too much on making deadlines or spending as few resources as possible may cause the quality of the work to suffer.
Oh, all right, Jesse, thanks so much for covering that. We do want to have a really quick learning check to make sure you all are awake and paying attention. So here's a quick poll. What are the key constraints in project management? Go ahead and select one of these, and then we will see who has the most. Let's see. All right, only a few more seconds to select your answer. All right. Jesse, as they're selecting, I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
I think a lot of us can actually see how some of these constraints relate to one another, but I wondered, how does the scope of a project really impact the quality of it?
Sure. Yeah, it might seem not that obvious why scope and quality are put together, but the scope is really about what the actual product or output of your project is. Mm-hmm. And the quality is very much connected because you have to be thinking too about what's the kind of minimum level of quality or quality control that those products need to meet. Mm-hmm. So it's not just that you're going to do a report or produce a video, but it needs to have a certain level of quality to it as well. And so that's why those two are tied together.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. And it looks like the majority of you guys were. Let's see. Okay, here, wait. So now the answer is scope, time, and resources. Jesse, how'd they do?
Pretty good.
All right. Awesome.
Excellent. All right, so good work so far, everybody. Scope, time, and resources are your three key constraints in project management. So let's talk about project management phases. So in the PMD Pro Model, we use 6 phases of project management. We start with project identification and design, then move on to project setup. After that, we move on to planning and implementation, which inform each other in an iterative cycle. The last phase is end of project transition, but throughout all of the other phases, you have project monitoring, evaluation, and control. So in identification and design, this is where you're defining the needs, exploring opportunities, and designing alternatives for what your project might look like. If you were applying for funding to a donor, this is where you'd be working on your proposal development. The next phase is setup, and this is where you're actually defining your parameters, you're identifying your stakeholders, and you're establishing how you're going to govern the project throughout the life of it. Now, this is actually a really important phase, but unfortunately, a lot of people and organizations tend to skip over it and go right into implementation after they get the funding for a project. The third phase is planning, and that's where you get into making that detailed implementation plan, which includes things like detailed budgeting and scheduling. And then you start working on implementation. This is the day-to-day project work. And you'll find that often once you start implementation, you need to adjust your plans. So that's why planning and implementation are cyclical. Now the 5th phase is monitoring, evaluation, and control. And this is really taking place across the entire project lifecycle. And this is where you're monitoring progress, evaluating impact, and making corrections as needed. And then finally, there's the end of project transition. So this is where you're confirming your project activities, and then you're either closing or renewing relationships, depending on whether the project will begin again or not. So.
All right, just another quick learning check. I know that's rapid fire, but we do want to make sure you guys are getting it. So we're going to launch this next poll and ask which of these phases takes place throughout the project management cycle: implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and control, setup, design and identification, planning, or end of project transition. Go ahead and put your answers in there. And also remember that you can feel free to ask questions anytime during the session by actually clicking on the Q&A box and asking us. Let's take a quick look. Make sure you've selected this. Okay. Jesse, I have a quick question for you regarding, let's see if we can see the results. Okay, nice. So this is monitoring, evaluation, and control. How'd they do, Jesse?
Great. Good work, everybody.
Awesome. I know a quick question that comes up quite a lot is regarding, what are the challenges that young social entrepreneurs, usually go throughout different phases. But the question I have for you is, is there a particular phase in the project management cycle that you often see young social entrepreneurs struggle with?
Well, I think that it really varies, but I would say, you know, there's definitely one big challenge area that we see a lot of is monitoring, evaluation, and control.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly, I think it's really helpful and relevant to use the PMD Pro model because it establishes monitoring and evaluation and control as something that takes place throughout the project life cycle. And oftentimes it can be something that gets added on later, and then it's not as effective as it could be. So that's one area. And then another thing I would say is actually project planning.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times we get these great ideas, and we might have them kind of sketched out in a big picture way. And then we might get funding for it through a proposal process or through fundraising. But then when we go to actually implement it, we might skip over the planning phase. Mm-hmm. And that might lose the opportunity to actually get some of the details, the scheduling, and those kinds of things sorted out so that the implementation can go more smoothly.
Okay. Awesome.
All right. So let's move on to the last section. This is project management disciplines. So there are 6 phases in project management. There are also 6 key disciplines to manage. Project management involves scope, time, resources, risk, project justification, and stakeholders. We're going to dig into some of these disciplines in detail in future learning sessions, but for now I'll just briefly explain each of them. So scope management is handling both what you need to deliver through the project as well as how you're going to do the work to deliver those things. Time is just what you're thinking. It's all about making a schedule for your project work and sticking to the schedule. Resource management is arranging and deploying your available resources, and this includes things like finances, supplies, staff and volunteer time, skills, equipment, and information technology. Risk management is handling the potential effect of uncertainty on the objectives of your project, and this will include both probability and impact of risk. The project justification is the discipline that focuses on demonstrating why a project makes sense to all the groups that are involved. This includes donors, the implementing organization, and the beneficiaries of the project as well. And finally, stakeholder management includes identifying all the individuals and groups that are involved in and impacted by the project, understanding their needs, and having an effective way to communicate with the different stakeholder groups. So I know that's a lot of information to absorb, but I wanted to just give you a quick sense of at least some of the key elements of project management, with those constraints, those phases, and these 6 disciplines to manage. We're going to dig into 2 of these disciplines and share practical tools momentarily, but first,
another learning check. Before we get to this learning check though, Jessie, I did want to go ahead and ask you a question that someone in the audience asked.
Great.
One question was, how do you stop yourself from over-obsessing over perfection in the planning process so that it doesn't impact the actual execution of that particular project?
Excellent. So this can be tricky. You can also, just like some people might tend to jump right into the implementation without proper planning, it can also be really easy to get stuck in the planning phase because you're trying to get every detail right. I think the important thing is to keep in mind the whole picture of the project management phases and the cycle. And remember that the planning phase is not about getting every detail perfectly because things will always change as the project unrolls. Mm-hmm. So if you try to keep a couple of things in mind, one is pick the tools that are going to be most useful in the planning process and just use those. There's a lot of tools out there and you don't need to use every one for every project. So just pick the few that are going to be the most useful and give yourself some set boundaries on how much time you're going to spend in the planning phase before you actually jump in and start doing the work. And then remember that you don't have to have every detail perfectly. You do want to try to think through all of the major elements, but then once you get into the implementation, that's where you actually go back to your planning documents and you want to keep using them as living documents so that you can refine and update as needed.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. I think also just to piggyback on that, my dad always says perfection is the enemy of progress. So I think that's kind of why we have the planning and implementation as an iterative process too.
Absolutely.
Okay. We're going to go ahead and launch this next poll. So pay attention. Which one of these is not a project management discipline? Is it scope, project justification, risk, resources, time, or planning? So go ahead and choose one pretty quickly, and we'll see if you guys were paying attention. So which one is not a project management discipline? Okay. And once we have it, let's see if we can get those results soon. Okay, Jesse, how did they do on this?
Well, I can't actually see the results.
Oh, I thought you could. So we've got 33% seeing project justification, 70% said time, and 50% said planning. And I actually think that 50% were correct.
Yes.
As a reminder.
You got it right. Good work.
As a reminder, which one are they?
So planning is one of the project management phases. It's not one of the disciplines. So it's got a lot of nuance and a lot of kind of technical frameworks that we've talked about, right? We've talked about constraints, we've talked about phases, we've talked about disciplines.
Awesome.
So project justification is actually a discipline, and again, that's the component that's making sure that the value of the project is clearly understood by everyone who's involved. Donors, whoever's implementing it, and the beneficiaries of the project as well. And then time is both a constraint and a discipline. So time management is super important to keep in mind throughout your project. And we're actually going to talk about that.
Nice.
So why don't we dig into time management? So this is all about making sure that project activities are completed on schedule. So time management comes into play most particularly in phase 1 of project management, which is identification and design, as well as phase 3, that planning phase. There are a lot of tools out there that are helpful for time management in your project work. So in phase 1, that might be the proposal itself. That's actually laying out what's going to happen in the project and how long it's going to take to do those things. But then you get into the details when you're doing the planning part. And so those tools might be activity sequencing, network diagram, or Gantt chart. We think that Gantt charts are a fantastic time management tool. So Gantt charts provide a visual representation of your project's timeline from start to finish, and they can be helpful in tracking the relationships between the different project elements. So when you create a Gantt chart, the first thing you want to do is break down your project into individual tasks. Then you need to determine how much time is required for each task and when it must be completed by. So you've got a deadline for each task. And then the last thing that you do is create that visual, either a line or you fill in blocks to show the timing of each task. And that really helps you get a big picture of how all of the pieces are impacted by each other and what their relationship is to each other. And one key note is when you're creating a Gantt chart for a complex project, it's really helpful to organize your tasks into groups that are related activities. So this is all kind of theoretical. Why don't we try a scenario? Earlier in the session, one of the examples I gave of a project was hosting a group of students as volunteers for social enterprises. So let's start putting together a Gantt chart to help us manage our time on this project. First, we can create a table with columns for task, timing, and deadline, and then a column for each unit of time that we want to visually display in our Gantt chart. So with the Gantt charts that I use, I often break things down by month, but you can use whatever unit of time is most useful for your project. That might be weeks, or it could even be day by day if you have a short-term project that's running for only a few weeks. So you just pick the one that's going to be most useful for you. We're going to assume in this scenario that the volunteer group is going to be visiting in August. So we just put the months March through July into the Gantt chart just to illustrate this example. So since we're hosting a group of volunteers, that's a fairly complex task, and we think it's helpful to break our project tasks down into groups. There are a lot of different kinds of activities that are involved in this project. but we're just going to use 2 as an example. So we thought we'd focus on logistics and then the recruitment of the volunteers. So under logistics, we started to make a list of individual tasks. For now, we're just going to use 3. So that's confirming the dates of the volunteer trip, booking accommodation for volunteers, and then arranging transportation to and from the airport. Once we came up with our list of activities or tasks that are related to logistics, then we decided to break down the timing and set deadlines. So you can see we decided that we should confirm the dates by April 1st. We should make sure that the accommodation for the volunteers is booked by the end of June, and then that we've arranged the transportation to and from the airport for the volunteers by the end of July, again for a trip in August. Then we moved on and decided to make a list of tasks related to the recruitment of the volunteers. We thought we needed to create a recruitment plan, finalize the recruitment materials, and send materials to the partners, and then also post the opportunity on social media. So then we mapped out the timing of those tasks. We decided that the recruitment plan and materials needed to be done in March, that we would send out the materials to partners to help with the recruitment process in April, and that we would post about the opportunity on social media from April through June, with the hope that we would have all of our recruitment done by the end of June.
Okay. Well, I'm really glad you sort of mapped this out across the entire scenario, Jesse. It's really helpful. I think a question that we had from the audience is there such a thing as spending too much time on a project?
Yes, there is.
What does that look like?
Well, that goes back to the key constraints, and that's why it's really helpful to keep those 3, time, scope, and resources in mind throughout your project, because you really want to make sure that all 3 are balanced at all times. If you get really, really focused on how much time you're spending, and you might drag out the time that you're spending, it could be because you're really worried about the quality, or it could be because you didn't actually do enough planning to figure out how much time or which things needed to get done. That's another thing that's really helpful about a Gantt chart as a planning tool, because this not only shows you, when things need to get done and gives you a really detailed plan that you can be using throughout your project implementation, but it also shows you the relationship between things, and so it can make it a lot easier to spot when you might have problems in your project plan. Like, what if there's something that needed to get done sequentially, but you didn't build in enough time to get it done before the next thing has to happen? So this is where that planning comes into play.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. I'm wondering, when you take a look at even the logistics and recruitment tasks here, is there anything that someone who's managing this project would be able to sort of consider immediately by looking at the blocks of time that it takes?
Sure. So yeah, I think there's a few key takeaways from our example Gantt chart here. The first thing is I wanted to point out that, we decided that we needed to have the dates confirmed for the volunteer trip by April 1st. But then we decided that we needed to have the recruitment materials finalized by March 31st so that we could send the materials out right away at the beginning of April. Now, that might not be realistic to try to get the dates set by April 1st, because we really want to have the dates in the recruitment materials, right? It's important when you're recruiting volunteers for them to know when they're coming. So we might want to reconsider that timing, actually, and try to work on confirming the dates of the volunteer trip earlier so that we have that ready to go for the recruitment materials. I think another thing that you might see here is that March is going to be pretty busy, especially if we keep the confirmation of the dates at the same time that we're also working on our recruitment plan and finalizing the actual recruitment materials. So that might be something helpful for the project team to think about, because this might not be the only project that they're working on. So this can also help you get a sense of, when you've got limited staff time or volunteer time working on a project, what all needs to be happening at the same time, and how to divide up those responsibilities, which we'll get into next.
Okay.
And then the last thing is that it's just kind of helpful to see that we have a small break once recruitment starts, where we don't have to focus on logistics for a little while. So that can also be really helpful for kind of planning and for how you're allocating, staff focus on different tasks and activities.
Okay. Before you move on, Jesse, we do have another question. One question is, how much of the whole process, do you envision being completed by a project manager directly? And should you have team members working on their components, or is it more effective if one person creates the whole plan?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really depends on the complexity of the project and the size of the team. It also really depends on the individual, like the team and the personalities. Some people are really detail-oriented and really love breaking things down and doing analysis. So if you've got somebody in your team who loves doing that, even if they're not the quote-unquote project manager, this might be the role for them to play, building this Gantt chart. But I do think it is very important to make sure that the whole team is on board with the Gantt chart before you actually start implementing. So you might decide that one person does the initial draft of it, and then you all sit down and review it, and then it gives everybody an opportunity to get familiar with all of the tasks, and then also to say, like, oh, hey, does it make sense for us to be working on confirming the dates of the volunteer trip by April 1st when we want to have the recruitment materials done by the end of March? Those kinds of things can be really helpful in the planning process.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse.
Sure. Okay. So we've talked about time management and the Gantt chart as a really great planning tool to help you with that in your project. And so now let's talk a little bit about resource management. So resource management includes managing finances, which is delivering your activities within budget, supply chain management, which is making sure that your resources are available and ready to be used efficiently, and then human resource management as well, which is making sure that your project staff are prepared to perform their tasks. Resource management is particularly important to consider when you're in phase 3, the planning phase of project management, as well as when you're in the implementation phase or phase 4. And some examples of tools that are particularly helpful for resource management are activity-based budgeting and earned value analysis when they're in the planning phase. And then when you're implementing, SWOT analysis, a spider diagram, or a RACI matrix. One of our favorite tools to use in managing resources is the RACI matrix, or sometimes it's called the RACI-D matrix. So this tool helps you determine who needs to be involved in the project and how they're going to be involved. So it's most useful during project implementation, and after you've created a detailed plan, such as a Gantt chart, that's when you can then go on to actually use this kind of a chart to help you determine who in the project team is playing which role and which responsibility. So let's define what each of these categories means, because that can be a bit confusing. So responsible refers to who is actually doing the task. This could be one person, or it could be a whole bunch of people. Accountable is who the person is that's making sure the job is done right. This could be someone who is also doing the work. So you could have the same name as responsible as well as accountable, or it could actually be somebody else. But one really important tip here is that no matter how many people you have responsible for doing a task, you should really only have one person who's accountable. Consulted is anyone whose input needs to be gathered before the responsible people can move forward with a given task. So this is really important to keep a distinction between who needs to be consulted before a task gets done versus who should just be informed. So those are the people that just need to get updates or be kept in the loop. So you can tell them what's going on during or after a project activity, but they don't need to be consulted before. You're not getting their input, you're just letting them know what's going on. And then finally, some people find it's important to also have a decision column. Now this is particularly useful if there's someone involved in the project who has to approve certain activities or decisions. For example, if you have a donor who needs to approve certain elements of your project, you might want to have a decision column. It could also be useful if you have a really large project team. So if you have a lot of names filled in on one line, it may be helpful to have one person in the decision column as the ultimate decision-making authority. But this is really up to you. It may not be that helpful for your project. We tend to not use a decision column for a lot of our projects that we're managing, but it might be helpful for some. And I mentioned already that you really should only keep one name in the accountable box. And in general, using a RACI matrix can also be really helpful for streamlining your project team. You might find that when you start to complete one of these, you have a lot of names and a lot of boxes. And it can be really helpful to take a step back and think, like, do I really need this many people working on this task? Or do I really need to consult all of those people for their input before this task gets done? So it can really help you with that streamlining process to make your project management a little more efficient. All right, so let's do a little scenario with the RACI matrix. We're going to go back to our example of hosting a volunteer group. So the first thing that we're going to do is take the tasks that we had come up with for our Gantt chart. So remember, we had those logistics-related tasks and we had those recruitment-related tasks. And then we made a little RACI matrix with the responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed columns. We decided for this project scenario, we didn't need to have a decision column. So then we filled this in. Now notice that in some cases there might be two people who are responsible, but there's only ever one person who is accountable for a given task. For some tasks, the accountable person is also the responsible person, but that's not always the case. Another thing you might notice is that some of the boxes are blank, and you don't actually need to have every box filled in your RACI matrix, and in fact that can be really great to keep things simple. If you don't absolutely need to gather somebody's input into a particular task, then leave the consulted box blank. It's totally fine to do it that way. All right, so now you've kind of seen an example RACI matrix and what this is all about. But Whitney, do you have any tips on how involving team members might work when you're creating a RACI matrix?
Well, absolutely, Jesse. Actually, there's a whole sort of bit about how to have a RACI conversation with your team members. And there's just a few points that I want to point out here. And one of them is you really want to make sure to include everyone with a role in this particular project or activity in on the conversation so they feel like they weighed in. You also want to make sure everyone understands what it actually means to be responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed, just as Jesse had mentioned before. When you have one of these conversations about whose role it is, it's usually a good time to have an open discussion about the team roles and responsibility overall. You also want to emphasize that everyone involved in specific tasks is encouraged to share ideas on the roles. So, for instance, if you're having this conversation with a group of your staff members, you really want to make sure everyone at least has some sort of input because it's not a one-person show. And also ensure that all members of the project team know where to find this RACI matrix later. So if you're sharing it on a particular hard drive or on a particular folder, you do want to make that known in public that, okay, here's where it is. This is how you're going to consult it throughout the project.
Great. Thanks, Whitney. That's really helpful. So one last thing I wanted to mention is that YouthActionNet, we actually really like to combine our Gantt chart and RACI matrix into one document for managing our projects. So this is a kind of small, it might be really small on your screen, but hopefully you can get a sense from the illustration up on the screen that we've got our tasks broken down for this particular project into different groups of activities. In this case, it's application, recruitment, and selection process for one of the fellowship programs. And you can see the individual tasks broken down. And we started with the Gantt chart, so we included our time period and the deadline, as well as the visual broken down by month. But then we went ahead and added in columns for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And then we also added in a status column because this is a living document. We consult this frequently throughout our project management, and we find it really helpful to be able to kind of check off when something is completed or something is in progress and make those updates as we go. All right, so now I know that we've covered a lot of information in the session. We want to give some more time to address questions that you might still have, but we're going to do a quick review first. So as we said, project management is a toolbox that helps you achieve your project goals efficiently and effectively. And all projects need to balance three key constraints. That's scope and quality, time and schedule, and then costs and resources. The PMD Pro model has 6 phases of project management. It starts with identification and design, then setup, planning and implementation, and your end of project transition with monitoring, evaluation, and control happening throughout. There are also 6 key project management disciplines, and that's scope, time, resources, risk, project justification, and stakeholders. So in this session, we focused a little bit more time on the time and resource management, and we shared 2 great tools to help you with these particular disciplines. So one is a Gantt chart, which helps you track your project tasks and see the relationship between the different elements of your project. And then the other is the RACI matrix, which helps you clarify roles and responsibilities so that your team really understands who is doing what on your project. And then as we showed you, you can actually combine these 2 tools into one document if you would like.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jessie, for taking us through the basics of project management and sharing those helpful tools. We will have some questions and answer session after this, so folks, hang on just a second. I see some more questions popping up in the toolbox there. We'd also like to thank our amazing sponsors, American Express and Laureate International Universities, for making this virtual session possible. Thanks so much for participants for joining. If you aren't already connected to YouthActionNet in any sort of way, feel free to follow us online, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and subscribe to our newsletter. In just a moment, we'll actually be sharing a link to a survey and session materials from here, so you won't have to wonder how to actually create a RACI matrix or a Gantt chart. And also, remember all the materials from the actual session. We have all of that together in a link here. So to hold on just a second for that as well. I see questions about that popping up. But if there's any more questions, we're actually going to open up the question and answer session now. And Jessie, we do have a specific question about the RACI matrix on this. Maya's asking, can you give a specific example here of the difference between accountable and responsible? Is there any way to sort of clarify those differences?
Sure. So as I mentioned, and that's a really great question, something that's super important to get clear with your project team, because that's where a lot of the, there's a lot of possibilities for kind of tension or misunderstanding if you don't have those roles clear. So as I mentioned, somebody could be both responsible and accountable, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. So for example, in our project management, the example Gantt and RACI that I showed briefly on the screen that we use for the Global Fellowship project management. In some cases, since I'm the overall project manager for the fellowship program, I might be the person who's accountable. That means that I'm the one who's keeping track of the fact that the tasks are getting done, but I'm not necessarily the person who's actually doing a particular task. So for example, with our recruitment and outreach for the Global Fellowship program, Whitney and Lisa were actually the ones who were managing all of the social media, posting the opportunity and reminding people to apply to the fellowship program, which by the way is still open.
Shameless plug there.
I wasn't actually doing any of the social media. I wasn't actually looking at the content itself or posting it directly because that was Whitney and Lisa's responsibility. But I might be the person accountable for that because I'm overall managing the project, and so I'm checking to make sure that it actually happened, but I'm not the one doing it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessie, for clarifying that, because it can be a bit difficult to understand what responsible and accountable is in that case. Definitely. We have another question, though, as well.
Great.
Leo's asking, for social businesses, do we need the 6th phase for the end of project transition as sales are continuous and simply increasing in scale over time? So what about that 6th phase for social?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It really depends on the project and what your model is. It's definitely important to pay attention to it in particular if some of what you're doing in your project or if all of your project is donor dependent. So if you are working with a particular donor or partner, it's really important to pay attention to that phase because you want to make sure that you are closing it out properly if it needs to be closed out. It might be that you're actually just continuing the relationship, but you might still need to take a moment, step back, look at what you got done in the project. Is it complete? Are all of the activities done the way that you said that you were going to do them, or have changes been documented as needed? And then in the case of, say, a donor relationship, that might be, talking to them about the possibility of renewing funding or continuing a partnership. Or they might decide not to continue that funding. And then that closeout might look just something like producing a final report. In reality, a lot of you might have projects that are ongoing and get funding at different times from different sources. So the project itself may not close out. You might just be looking at how you're continuing it, or you're doing the next phase the following year. And that's great, but you do want to at least make sure that you're not completely ignoring the end of project transition phase, because you at least want to make sure that you've thought about it and you've decided, okay, we don't need to do anything, rather than just forgetting about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessie, for answering that question. I think in the back of people's minds, they're also probably a little overwhelmed by the amount of material that's involved in project management. And I know you discussed two main tools here, but do you have plans of actually coming back and joining us for more sessions on project management so you can get a bigger picture of what's going on?
Yes, absolutely. So we wanted to start with just kind of laying a foundation of some of the basic concepts and principles to keep in mind. But we also really wanted to be able to share something that was going to be a little bit practical, particularly because we know that those of you who are tuning in today are already managing projects. So we wanted to give you something that you could start using tomorrow. So hopefully the Gantt chart and the RACI matrix will be useful tools for you all. But we know that we couldn't cover everything, and so we will come back, and we've gotten input from many of you about the areas that you're most interested in. And if you, after seeing today's session, have other ideas about what you really want to know, then please let us know. We can't promise to do everything. I mean, to do an actual project management certification is like a full 3 days of training. So we can't promise that we're going to be able to get to everything, but we definitely want to come back. We know that risk management is something a lot of people are really interested in knowing more about. We know monitoring and evaluation is something people are interested in knowing more about, as well as budgeting. So we do want to try to get to those topics and anything else that we can cover to help you all.
Awesome, thanks. We have another question. Oh, two more questions. So if you have any more questions, now's the time to be typing them in. One question again deals with the RACI matrix, Jessie.
Okay.
The question is, with the RACI tool, is this strictly limited to internal role players of our organizations, or can we have someone be part of this, say if they're lacking in a specific skill to get a task done? So is it specifically like an internal process, or can it also be something where others help out?
It could definitely include external folks. You want to think about your project team holistically. That's something that's really important. So anybody who's really directly working on the project should be included. That might include volunteers. It might include board members. That could possibly even include somebody who's from a partner organization or a donor. So it's really, the tool is meant to be something that you can also adapt to make it as useful as possible for your context. So if it's something that's really helpful for you to have just for internal purposes, so everybody is aware internally, you can do it that way. If it's really helpful for you because maybe a partner organization or an individual who's outside the organization is working on the project and they don't really understand their role, it might be really helpful to actually include them in the process of creating that RACI matrix, or at least sharing the document with them so that they understand, oh, this is what my role is, and also understanding what everybody else's role is. So if they have a question about something, they know who to go to.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessie. We got one last question. So in addition to our great resources that we've provided, do you know of any places online where folks can get further training on project management?
Absolutely. There are a lot of different opportunities out there. So I know that there are trainings sessions available and workshops where you can actually get certified in PMD Pro. There are online versions as well. And so if you wanted to get like the full certification, you could do that either through an in-person workshop or online. But there are actually also some great free resources that are available. You can always just put in a Google search for PMD Pro or project management resources. But there's actually a really great website that I discovered that's called PMD Pro Starter. And it's got some really handy, it's got tools, and it's got really quick little tutorials and guides and little videos that you can watch. So it gives you some really specific examples of project management tools and shows you how to use them. And the language is really clear and it's super easy to use. So PMD Pro Starter is a great resource to check out, and it's free.
Awesome, and we've just also put that link right in the chat box, so make sure to follow that as well. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If there's no other questions, we hope to see you at our next virtual learning session. We're hoping to cover the topic of social impact, which I'm sure you guys will be interested in. But before you actually do anything else, I really highly recommend you take this survey for us so then you can have access to the rest of our resources on project management. And again, thanks so much for joining, and we will see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jessie. To you too.